Alrighty, hello everyone, and welcome to the Reformed Dissenters. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to us or watching us, depending on whatever platform you are on. My name is Bruce Johnson. I am joined here in the wonderful state of South Dakota with my good friend Joseph Lassiter.
Hello.
And we are also joined today by Gary DeMar. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I was glad to be seen by all of you and to be interviewed and we'll see what happens.
Yes. Yes, indeed. So we're very excited to have Gary DeMar on with us on the show today. We got some very exciting topics to discuss, and we're so glad that he agreed to join us today. So if you would like to share this show with your friends, and we would really love you to do that, go to trdshow.net, grab that link, and share it with as many people as you can. We also have our brand new referral program, so you can start earning points towards free merch. So we have t-shirts, free mugs, free stickers, all sorts of cool stuff. Go to trdshow.net/refer. Also, you can email the show, get in contact with us at trdshow@protonmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And if you're interested in following us on platforms that don't censor you and actually care about free speech, follow us on our pro-First Amendment platforms such as Gab TV, Rumble, Getter, and a whole host of others. And you can find all of those on our website. As just a quick announcement, just remember that this week on April 7th, is our Rapid City event, the cross-politic event here in Rapid City. So very exciting. It's not too late to register. If you are interested in that, go to crosspolitic.com/Liberty Tour. Gary DeMar is going to be speaking there, which will be very neat. Jacob Johnson, my brother, wasn't able to join us today because he's actually on his way driving out here for the event. So, but it's still going to be a really cool conversation, and we're very excited about this event. We got a lot of stuff planned, so definitely go to crosspolitic.com/Liberty Tour and register for that. So show breakdown. What's going to happen today? First of all, we're going to have our interview, our discussion with Gary DeMar. We have some very interesting topics that I'd love to bring up and discuss with him, get his perspective on some of that. And we're going to introduce him as well. For those of you who haven't heard of him, we're going to introduce him in a second. And then after that, we're actually going to be moving on to our Literature of the Month, and we're going to be reading Gary DeMar's book, God and Government, Volume 2. So we read Volume 1 a couple months ago on the show. Now we're moving on to Volume 2, repeating the same theme. And it's really neat that we get to have the author of the book on the show with us. I think this is it's a new TRD show history right here. So very cool. But before we get to all of that, we have to talk about the verse of the week. And our verse this week is Psalms 19, verses 7 through 8. And it says, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes." And again, that was Psalm 19, verses 7 through 8. And so, we're talking about, especially in these two chapters, and over the past month, we read Greg Bonson's book, Always Ready. We're talking about worldview, we're talking about presuppositions, all of those sorts of things, and where should we be getting that from, right? As Christians, the Word of God should be where we draw our presuppositions from, our worldview, all of that. So this psalm, I thought, just really spoke to that very clearly. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. Testimony of the Lord is sure. Precepts of the Lord are right. So we need to remember these things when we're talking about worldviews, when we're talking about presuppositions, all of these sorts of things. So, all right, let's move into our discussion with our guest, Gary DeMar. And I did want to kind of introduce him. He has served as the president of American Vision for 35 years. If you haven't heard of that, AmericanVision.com, I believe it is.
.org.
.org, thank you.
Yes.
AmericanVision.org is just a fantastic site. So many resources on there. I think you can get the book, God and Government, directly from the site, in addition to all of the other books that Gary has written. So definitely check that out. He's a graduate of Western Michigan University, 1973, and earned his master's in divinity at Reformed Theological Seminary in 1979. He's written countless essays, news articles, and more than 35 book titles. He's been featured by nearly every news media outlet, and he also has his own show, The Gary DeMar Show, as well as History Unwrapped. I'll have to look up that one. That one I haven't heard, but sounds really interesting. And Gary DeMar's Vantage Point web show, and is a regular contributor to AmericanVision.org. Oh, it wasn't there. I just needed to read a little further. So thank you so much, Gary, for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Well, most of some of that, it's a little old since podcasting is taking place. I do 3 podcasts a week and 2 articles a week.
Wow.
The other things aren't really applicable anymore. Those were the days before we had podcasting. So right now I'm doing podcasting, like I said, three days a week. And
Nice.
You can go to AmericanVision.org and various platforms. We're on the Canon app as well.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. That's the Canon Plus.
Yes.
Nice. Very neat. That's a
I
wonderful
do
platform too.
I do a heavy lifting for the cross politics folks as well. One a week.
Wow. Very cool. Very cool. I'll have to check some of these out myself as well. That's really neat. Awesome. Well, moving on to our first discussion, in light of current events and the political climate that we've seen, especially in the past 2 years, given the fact that as Christians, we're called to be salt and light, and that's our theme. Matthew 5:13 is our theme verse for the show. What would be some practical steps that a Christian could take to affect their communities, their country, or their state? We hear about a lot of hypothetical, we hear a lot about idealistic, this is where we're going. We need to get here. What does the Bible say about culture, right? But what, Gary, do you think are some practical steps that we can start tomorrow or today to start to get there? What would you recommend?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote God and Government, the first volume of God and Government came out in 1982. You're all very, very young. You have no idea what was taking place in the 70s and then in the 80s. But in 1976, Jimmy Carter was elected president, and he was touted as a born again Christian, which was something new to the media at that time. They had no idea what a born again person was.
Wow.
Billy Graham actually had to write a book called How to Be Born Again, which is kind of in and of itself is a little crazy. So it was really the first time that Christians kind of entered the political realm as a singular voice, a community of believers that had something to say regarding politics. But it turned out that Jimmy Carter was a disappointment in terms of his Christian values and so forth. He supported the homosexuality. He didn't really oppose abortion. His economic policies were off the chart. Those were the days when interest rates were, mortgage rates were like 15%. Inflation was rampant.
Wow.
It was something called stagflation, with inflation high prices going up, and at the same time the economy wasn't moving forward. We were still in something of a Cold War with the former Soviet Union. That was the time that I grew up in. Of course, I was born much earlier than that. I was born in 1950, but in the 1970s, that's where we were. And the Christians finally, because I think of Jimmy Carter, finally had a voice. There was always a liberal side of Protestant Christianity, which was a voting bloc, and plus you had Roman Catholics and you had the Jewish vote. But for the most part, you did not have a Christian vote. That just wasn't something that people talked about very much. And then Jerry Falwell came along and started an organization called the Moral Majority. And this was a real change for Jerry Falwell, because earlier he had written about ministers and marches and said, look, we shouldn't be involved in all these things. And that was kind of a reaction to the civil rights movement at the time. But he began to realize that if we're going to have an impact on the culture, Christians need to be involved politically. And so he started an organization called the Moral Majority. And because of the dissatisfaction with Jimmy Carter, because of economics, as I think James Carville said, it's the economy, stupid. There may be lots of things that people wouldn't agree with us on the social issues and so forth, but the bread and butter, how much money are you taking home? What are you paying in taxes? What about prices and so forth? People pay attention to that. And that was an issue in the late 1970s. And so Ronald Reagan came along as a conservative, spoke as a conservative, and spoke nominally as a Christian, and essentially wiped the floor with Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election. And I think at that time, Jimmy Carter won, I think maybe 4, possibly 5 states, and Ronald Reagan won all the rest of them.
Wow.
And so it was a real landslide. And Christians had a lot to do with this. They were a public voice, and they were offering themselves to the political realm. In 1980, Ronald Reagan spoke to a massive gathering of pastors. I mean, again, this was so new that to say that, I don't know, 5,000 to 10,000 pastors would show up for a roundtable meeting in Dallas, Texas in the 1980s and hear a presidential candidate. That was something that was very, very new.
Wow.
Politically. So it was recognized that Christians did, in fact, have a role to play politically. And so, but as this sweep that took place, this landslide that took place, wife and I were living in Georgia at the time. We were originally from Pennsylvania, but from seminary we moved to the Atlanta area. And we had a very conservative congressman named Larry McDonald, who was a Democrat, actually.
Wow.
And he was one of 2 Dr. No's. And he was a medical doctor, and there was also Dr. Ron Paul. And they were constitutionalists who essentially said no to everything if it wasn't constitutional.
Yeah. Wow.
And as I was watching this landslide taking place that evening, of the election evening, at a hotel where Larry McDonald had a victory party, I just kind of hit me that most of these people who had voted thought that they had won the war, and all they had done was they won a particular battle. One battle. There's a war out there, and they don't recognize this.
Yes.
And it was oftentimes, very typical of Christians to say, we won, we can go home now. Well,
go back to normal.
They didn't do it. Because in 1984, Ronald Reagan won again, and this time I think Walter Mondale only got his home state of Minnesota, so it was even a bigger landslide. But at the same time, I just began to feel that Christians need to understand government, because the last thing we as Christians want to do is to say we want to take over the government, whatever power and authority the government has right now. We just want to Christianize it.
Right.
And so all the agencies, the Christians would take them all over, and that was something that that's neither a constitutional standard nor a biblical standard, and so that's why I sat down and wrote the first volume of God and Government in 1982.
Wow.
And so when someone asks, what are some of the steps we can take, real practical steps we can take, the first practical step we need to take is we need to get educated.
Yes.
We need to know how things work. The politicians, these people, some people have been here's Joe Biden, who has been in politics essentially all his life. And there are others there, Nancy Pelosi and many others, Schumer and so forth. Some of these people have been there for more than 40 years. And we have to recognize that there are certain fundamental principles that have to be followed, and our goal isn't just to take over the government. This is something that's kind of a parody of what Christians at least should believe. That's not what we're all about. But in order to understand all this, we need to be educated. What does the Bible say about these issues? What does the Constitution say about these issues? So the first practical step is, in fact, getting an education on these fundamentals, and so that's it. That's the beginning part of this. And look, things have changed dramatically. I mean, again, you're very young. You don't know. When I was back then, you basically had three networks: ABC, CBS, NBC. There's no internet. You had daily newspapers. Some cities had a morning edition. Some people had an evening edition. I mean, New York at one time, I think, had 6 different newspapers.
Wow.
So in Pittsburgh, you had the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in the morning, the Pittsburgh Press in the afternoon. So these were your news sources. This was it.
Wow.
And so getting involved politically at that particular period of time was, somewhat different from what it is today. And the left, I always tell people, the left never quits. They lose a battle, they're going to come back and they're going to regroup and come back even stronger the next time. And a lot of conservatives, and Christians included, just don't know how to win. They if they lose an election, they say, well, we did our best, we're going to go home, and there's nothing we can do about anything. There's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. So the first part is educational, and the second part is organizational. That you have to be organized in a way to know how the system works, so that if you're going to get involved politically, you've got to figure out what can be done at the local level, your city level, county level, and state level, because that's really the basics of politics. And then when you get involved politically, now what do we do? What these people we elect to office, what should they be doing?
Right.
And that's one thing we really haven't won, because both political parties are oftentimes in this for the politics and the power and the money. And again, we don't put enough pressure on these people. But I think that's beginning to change. I think because of the new direction in social media and what's available today, we're able to do an end run around the media. And by the way, the media has always been somewhat liberal in this area. They've very rarely would you call them siding with Republicans. That just wasn't the case. I mean, even Fox News is something new. CNN is relatively new as well. But what's happening in terms of social media, like what you're doing and what others are doing, I think we're making an impact. So you've got to get education, organization are the two fundamentals, and then you had a third one, participation. You have to be actively involved in what's happening in our culture, and we're seeing this a little bit with a lot of these school boards where parents have finally said we're fed up with this, and they've made a significant impact. So those are the three legs of the necessary stool that's out there, the political stool, in order to get involved.
Nice. That's that's really good stuff. That is really good stuff. I'm not even going to add to that. That's good. I had here to discuss a little bit of the synthetic worldview that you mentioned on page 234, at least in the version that I have. And I think it fits in really well to this discussion. Well, I said I wasn't going to add to it, but here I am adding to it. So, oh well. But that synthetic worldview. I mean, you said a synthetic worldview attempts to mix the Christian worldview with some elements of the humanistic worldview. And that's definitely what we're seeing, and it sounds like that was what you were seeing with the Carter administration, where he was probably just flat out claiming it so that he would get the vote and wasn't actually Christian. But that whole idea where it's like, well, okay, they're Christian. It's like rhinos for Christians, right? Christian in name only, essentially, where they don't understand what a Christian worldview actually looks like. And we're going to be getting into that when we talk about the literature.
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of it is that Christians, it's one of the things I'll be speaking on at this conference in South Dakota. A lot of Christians aren't educated. They have a number of cliches that they hold on to. Like they'll say, well, Jesus didn't get mixed up in politics, so why should I get mixed up in politics? Jesus said we're not supposed to judge, so we can't judge anyone. There's a separation between church and state. Politics is dirty. We must obey the civil magistrate no matter what takes place. You can't impose your morality on other people. Our citizenship is in heaven. We're living in the last days. So you can.
You've heard a lot of these.
and that's the point. You've heard a lot of these, and a lot of people use these as excuses as to why they shouldn't get involved, and they think that they're being Christian and biblical, by making those claims, and as a result, they don't get involved. And then, of course, the big one that isn't necessarily a biblical explanation, but there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Well, there is a difference between the two parties, but even if there weren't a difference between the two parties, the point is to be involved to make sure there's a difference between the two parties. But you have to understand that the role of civil government in Scripture is very limited.
Yep.
And the same is true of the Constitution of the United States. So not only must you understand what the Bible has to say about jurisdictional separation and jurisdictional limitations, but you have to understand the Constitution itself. And the Constitution isn't a very long document. The reason it's not a very long document is because it only granted a certain number of powers to the national government and left the rest of them to the states. And if the states didn't have those powers, they were left to the people. Yeah. And it's unfortunate a lot of Christians like free stuff. They like the government to do things for them.
Yes.
And as a result, we don't make an impact because we're synthetic. We say, hey, I'm a Christian. I believe we should get involved in politics, but we need to take care of the poor. And if we're going to take care of the poor, we need to be taxed more so the government can take this money and take care of the poor.
Yeah.
Same thing with education. The Department of Education, the National Federal Department of Education, didn't exist until Jimmy Carter's administration, and it had to be voted on by Republicans as well. And yet we sent men to the moon before we had a federal Department of Education. Yeah, we never needed a federal Department of Education. You got the city of Baltimore that probably spends more money per capita on students, and yet has the worst rankings in terms of academics. Money isn't the issue.
Just saw an article over the weekend of somebody suing Baltimore, the city of Baltimore, because their kid graduated from high school and can't read.
Yeah, and that's the two things that government officials advocate, and too many people fall for it, is give us more power, give us more money, and we'll fix things. They create the problem in the first place. Why would you then turn to give them more power and more money to try to fix what they caused as the problem? I always tell parents, I said, look, get a set of McGuffey's readers and have your children read the McGuffey's readers and find out where they are on the academic scale. Yep. And Dr. Gary North used to tell the story about a law professor who had his students read out of McGuffey's readers some of the legal issues in there, and they could not understand what was being read. I think some of it was from Blackstone's writings. Okay. So there's so much wrong out there. Yes. That the way you change those things is not by giving more power and more money to the national government. That is, we take responsibility for these things in the area of education, for example. Yep. And you want to change the society, and the Roman Catholic Church understood this a long, long time ago, where they would always have schools associated with the diocese, with the parish. And I grew up Roman Catholic, and so St. Gabriel's had St. Gabriel's School, and then the population of that area grew so much that they ended up with another parish, and that was St. Gabriel's, and they had a school. You don't find that with Protestants today. It's not that they don't have schools. They just don't have them and think in terms of how Roman Catholics understood education. They believed, hey, if you're really going to change the world according to your religion, you've got to do the education. You can't turn it over to the state in order to do that. Exactly. So they understand it better than us. And the Dutch did the same thing. If you go up to a city like Grand Rapids, Michigan, you'll drive by these schools and you say, "Oh, that's a beautiful public school." Well, they weren't public schools; they were private schools that the Dutch who settled in that area, built those schools because they wanted their children to learn in terms of the worldview that they were teaching at that time.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. That's a really great point. And I'm really excited to get into a little bit more of that worldview stuff as well. But I did want to just briefly touch on something that we've had this debate on the show a couple times between the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation. Jake and I have had those, debates numerous times. We read a portion in your book, the first volume that touched on that, so that kind of sparked that as well. But, I really just wanted to get your take on the key differences between the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, and in addition, which document you think would be best to try and get back to. Obviously, we're far away from both at this point, but in an idealistic world, what should we be reaching for as the ideal?
Well, historically, the representatives were sent to Philadelphia to amend the Articles of Confederation. They were not sent to put together a brand new constitution. They were because what had happened is that the Articles of Confederation did not give enough national power to the national government.
Yep.
So when you went up against Great Britain, there was no national way to bring forces against Great Britain in this case, and so they saw that as a weakness of the Articles of Confederation. Yeah. I'm not sure it was a weakness, but that's all in hindsight. But they did, in fact, understand that the national government needed to be limited in its power and authority. The other thing the Articles of Confederation did, it did not begin with "we the people." It didn't begin with this idea that we're essentially a pure democracy, although the Constitution itself doesn't really lend itself to a pure democracy. But the highest authority in the Constitution of the United States is in fact "we the people," the "we the people" generally. But the Articles of Confederation it was more theistic than the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the United States, while it still has elements of a Christian worldview in it, limited government, jurisdictional separation between at least the national government and the state governments in the First Amendment, has certain freedoms spelled out, enumerated powers. That was the case as well.
Yep.
It says it's done in the year of our Lord, 1787. It has the President of the United States essentially has Sunday off in terms of accepting or vetoing legislation. He has 10 days in which to sign a bill into law. Sunday's accepted. You have gold and silver to pay for debts. 2 to 3 witnesses in terms of trial, in terms of treason. So there are elements of the Christian worldview in there.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, it starts with "we the people." There's no greater source of authority than the people generally. So that was one of the big flaws. That was one of the things that Gary North had written about in his book Political Polytheism. He saw this as a coup. It was the Articles of Confederation were supposed to be amended and updated. There wasn't supposed to be a brand new constitution.
Yeah.
But at the same time, if you go back and look and say "we the people," say, okay, well, if we the people were in fact Christians who understood the Constitution and the directives from the Bible regarding the limitations of political power and constitutional power, that wouldn't have mattered so much. I'm not sure that putting all those types of things into the Constitution would have mattered, because there are lots of things in the Constitution right now that people who take an oath to uphold the Constitution don't pay any attention to. You can't have a bill that's 2,700 pages long that's essentially expands the power of the federal government.
Right.
When probably 98% of what's in it is contrary to the Constitution itself. I mean, here Israel had God's law, all the specifics of God's law. That was no guarantee that they were going to keep that law. So that's why you did first volume of God and Government. That's why it begins with God as a governor of all things, and then the more important government under that is the self-government.
Yep.
You want to change a society, you yourself have to change, and there have to be enough people to change in order to make fundamental changes nationally. And so those are important features. And look, that's hard to do. You got pastors in the church who just aren't going to talk on these things. Number one, they don't know what to talk about these things, and number two, they don't want controversy in their church because there are probably different political affiliations in their own church. And if the church isn't paid for, you got a third of your congregation that walks away, then you're left holding the note on the building that hasn't been paid.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Joe, you had something to add?
Yeah. Since we're on the topic of Articles of Confederation and Constitution, have you heard of what a Convention of States is?
Oh yeah. Mark Levin has been pushing the Convention of States.
So with that idea in mind, do you think that if we did a Convention of States today, it would pretty much be the exact same thing as back when they were supposed to just amend the Articles of Confederation, that they got the Constitution? Do you think that would happen again, do you think?
Well, again, that's the problem. I mean, it happened the first time. And what guarantee do we have that we could make these fundamental changes? I mean, who first of all, who do you trust to do this? That's number one. Who do you trust?
Right.
Who out there from our camp is qualified to do that? We probably find quite a few people who are qualified. Number three, you've got rhinos who want their particular perspective in there, who wouldn't want some of these people involved. They want someone like Ron Paul involved in it. I doubt it.
Yeah.
Someone like Ted Cruz, Mark Levin, for example. Who would actually go there? Who would represent the states in all of this? And so, as we got 50 states, and so the liberal states. Let's just look. By point of fact, liberal states are going to push a liberal agenda, and every representative that's going to be sent to this new constitutional convention, they're going to be very liberal. So think about your particular state. Who would you send? And then you got to think about some of these purple states. Who you've got the governor of Maryland. The governor of Maryland is a Republican, and he blasted Ron DeSantis over this bill that their House and Senate passed, and he signed into law, and he just condemned the whole thing, and even admitted he hadn't even read it yet. So who's going to make it there? And to make these fundamental changes. I don't know. They've got a lot of Republicans out there, supposed conservative. You got Sean Hannity. Sean Hannity attacks this Supreme Court nominee because she won't define what a woman is, and because she says she's not a biologist,
Right.
And yet he's extolling the virtues of Fox News by having Bruce Jenner on the show and acknowledging him as a she.
Exactly.
So here you go with, would you trust Sean Hannity? I wouldn't trust Sean Hannity. And I don't know where Mark Levin is on this topic. You've got a lot of libertarians when it comes to homosexuality, transgenderism, and abortion are not on our side.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really good points. Yeah, thank you. I wish we had more time to keep discussing some of this, but we do have to move on. So thank you very much for your input on that. There were definitely a few. We'll have to have you on back again sometime, and I'd love for Jake to be here as well, because we've had some really interesting discussions on Constitution versus Articles of Confederation. A lot of times it especially went back to taxation, because the Constitution allowed for federal taxation on that level, whereas the Articles of Confederation, levies.
Well, you have to remember now
Go
the income tax amendment was not part of the original, not part of the
Hmm.
original Constitution.
Right.
And see, the people were snookered on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
But
well,
it did open the door to that eventually.
Yeah, it won't affect us because only the rich people were going to be affected by it all,
Right.
and it wasn't that much. And so, once we got off the gold standard and we just started printing money,
Yeah.
and everybody's supposed wealth went up in numbers, and now they're part of the the rich now, and they're being taxed in ways that it wasn't sold to the people that way. Only the rich people were going to pay this tax.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yep, definitely. Cool. All right, so kind of switching gears here. We have you on, so I figured we'd take full advantage of it and cover every topic possible. So
Okay.
So shifting gears to kind of people have really strong reactions when they hear words like theonomy or postmillennialism. The question I think in our circles is, why do people have these sorts of reactions? I know growing up, I've always wondered that. What is it that they think they hear when they hear theonomy or postmillennialism? And then how do we change their perceptions and maybe address those negative stereotypes? How do we understand that and combat it?
Well, I try not to use code words that we bring up and we develop and we define. I just always thought that was kind of a mistake. I know why people do it. When Greg Bahnsen wrote his book Theonomy and Christian Ethics, his attempt wasn't to start a movement and to name it theonomy, but it just ended up that way. Same thing with Christian Reconstruction. The journal Christian Reconstruction came out, and so it was like, now we're going to deal with Reconstructionism and theonomy.
Yeah.
But it's probably kind of inevitable. No matter what you do, that sort of takes place.
Yeah.
But it becomes a shorthand for stereotyping.
Yep.
And that's, I think, a huge mistake, because what people do is they hear the word theonomy and then someone defines it very narrowly and inaccurately, and they say, oh, that's what that is. And so when they hear the word, they immediately attach the definition that they got to it.
Yeah, without researching it further or looking it up. Yeah.
And post-millennialism, I don't use post-millennialism because all the millennial issues are built on Revelation chapter 20, which I don't believe is describing either pre-mill, post-mill. Probably the all-mills have it more, because it's not describing what you and I think of what a millennium would be. And so you want to start talking about the kingdom of God, that's a little different.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about theonomy, you talk about I always say applying all of God's word to all of life.
Yes.
And then people come and say, well, what about this law? And I said, well, that's obviously when you apply all the Bible to all of life, also includes within the New Testament changes in the law that are very, very specific.
Yep.
You read the book of Hebrews and so forth and so on.
Yes.
So that gives you a better opportunity to explain things. And I wrote 3 chapters in the book Theonomy and Informed Response, where I demonstrated that long before theonomy became an issue, that there were Reformed writers who were talking about applying the Bible to all areas of life. And it's amazing how many there were who were doing that.
Yes.
And if you went into a church today, you went into a charismatic church today or Baptist church, and said, the pastor got up in the pulpit and said, we as Christians should be applying all the Bible to all of life. And I bet you, I would assume that the majority of people will say, that's right, Pastor, that's right. Now, somebody might say, well, wait a minute, what about this law and that law? And then the pastor gets up there and he attempts to explain how that law, whether it's changed or not, or where there's a principle approach to it, and so forth and so on.
Yes.
So that's the kind of the philosophy I've taken, is to let's apply all the Bible to all of life. And look, even liberals do this. How many times have you seen liberals go to the Bible to apply the Bible to their view? They think the Bible teaches socialism. Hillary Clinton, when she was asked what the most important book was, she said the Bible was. And of course, they cherry pick it, but a lot of Christians cherry pick it too.
Yep.
So I'm for not using those types of phrases. And just getting to applying the Bible to all of life. I don't use postmillennialism. I talk about just eschatology in general, and then have to deal with the specific views of eschatology, and then see if they comport with what Scripture has to say. That takes time. But if you already go in there and say, well, I'm a postmillennialist, well, you just immediately put up barriers for lots of people. First of all, many of them have no idea what that means. So you really have to articulate for people the specifics of these various positions. You never start with postmillennialism. You have to start with prophetic passages that determining whether those prophetic passages relate to events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or do they pertain to something else? And that's where I always start. People say they want to come and talk on postmillennialism. I say, I'm not going to do that. I'll come and talk about these other, Matthew 24, 2 Thessalonians 2, parts of the book of Revelation and so forth, in order to lay out for people kind of a more nuanced perspective that they probably haven't heard before. I have a little thing about clearing the prophetic or the eschatological chessboard. There's things you got to clear off the table, clear off the board before you can start talking about kind of an optimistic eschatology, because people will say, well, Matthew 24 talks about wars and rumors of wars and famines and beasts and antichrist and so forth. So you got to deal with all those first before you can deal with the broader concepts of eschatology, especially the so-called millennial views.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and Joe and I have had those discussions as well, talking about we use these terms and everybody has different connotations attached to them, and instead of going bullheaded into the conversation and just throwing that term, I'm this, actually explaining, well, here's what I believe, and here's the biblical passage that I'm drawing this from, and this is why I believe this.
Just telling say, hey, before we get into this discussion, we need to define our terms.
And
that's important as well, because you can start talking past one another. I say, I was using that word to mean this, and I was using this word to mean that.
Yes.
So what you want to do is you want to start with defining your terms, as to make sure you're talking about the same thing. So, I didn't know that's what that position believed. I was always told those people believe that. Say, no, that's not what it teaches at all.
Yep.
And look, I've been doing this a long time, and I'm imparting my wisdom to you on how not to do things and a better approach with all of this. And I have a little saying. It is mine. I don't know anyone else who has said it, but don't give anyone a reason to reject your position other than the position itself. So you don't become the issue. Number one, and number two, you need to define what you're talking about, so you can that you're talking about the same thing.
Right.
Because a lot of, I think, disagreements come about because you start talking about postmillennialism, and people they've already have a view in their mind about what postmillennialism is, and then you start talking about postmillennialism, but it's not what they think. It's not what they think it is. Yep. And then you lose them right at the start.
Yes. They immediately go into defensive mode and just I heard that word. Now I'm going to go into the turtle shell and just start defending without actually hearing. Yep. Absolutely. Wow. That was really good. Thank you. Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
I got a question right before we get into the literature segment. We heard what inspired you to write God and Government Volume 1, but what inspired you to continue writing the God and Government
good
series,
question.
Volume 2 and Volume 3?
Now that's a funny story. I have a good friend, Archie Jones, who really is an expert on the Constitution, separation of church and state. In fact, he has a dissertation that's about 800 pages just on the First Amendment that he's.
Wow.
It needed to be completely retyped because he wrote it at a time when it was a completely different software program and it couldn't be modified or changed or transferred.
Oh man.
So anyway, so Archie. Remember, I wrote this in 1982. I just graduated from seminary in 1979, and so I was kind of out on a limb a bit with a lot of things, and so I sent the first draft to Archie, and so Archie said, "Gary, you need to cover this. 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 You need to cover this." So I did all that, and then I sent it back to him again. He said, "Well, now you need to cover this, this, this." That was volume 2.
Wow.
And so when I finished volume 2 after his suggestions, I sent volume 2 to him, and he said, now you need to cover this, this, and this, and this, and that's how I got volume 3.
Wow. Wow.
So that's the simple answer to it all, is that Archie said I needed to cover more stuff, and that's I might have done it anyway, but Archie was the catalyst for it. And I did. Gary North had come up with this 5-point covenant model, which, if you actually read the God and Government series, it does kind of follow within that mold. Who's in charge, to whom do I report? That would be the representatives of the person in charge. What's the law? What happens if you break the law? Good and bad. And does this outfit have a future? Eschatology. So all of that those three volumes, which is now in one hardback volume. Mm-hmm. They lay that principle out. It starts with the sovereignty of God and man's understanding or man's role under the sovereignty of God. Then the application of God's law to every area of life, the positive and negative sanctions, and then it ends with the eschatological aspect of it all.
That's very cool. Yeah, good question, Joe. Yeah,
a lot of good information.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of that, it is about time to move on to the literature segment, and we're going to try and keep this. I had a lot more discussion topics as backup questions, which would have been cool to get to, but we'll have to do them in another episode with Gary sometime. That would be very cool. So we, moving on to the literature segment, we read God and Government Volume 2 this month. We're reading that this month. This is our first episode with Volume 2, so we read chapters 1 and 2. And just to kind of kick things off, I'm using this, if you're watching us instead of listening to us, I have my hard copy here. You actually sent me that copy, Gary, so thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it. So the page numbers that I reference are for the hard copy. So if you're trying to look up the page numbers and you're like, what are you talking about? There's not 200 pages in this book. Where 205? What is this? It's in the hard copy. So, and Joe has the paperback version. So I probably should have conferred with you to get some of these actual page references. But we did notice actually there were some differences between the hard copy and the paperback in terms of the content, and some of the graphics and stuff was a little different. So, but anyways, moving on, I have, let's see, what is it? 4 different topics that I want to get to, and we'll just briefly touch on each of these. But these 2 chapters really spoke to worldviews. What they are, the importance of having the correct one, what a biblical worldview looks like, all of that kind of stuff. And this actually goes really well with our last book, which was Always Ready by Dr. Greg Bahnsen, because we were talking about presuppositions and worldviews and all of that. So this is kind of just a continuation of that, which is really cool. And I really appreciated some of the ways that you stated this. So I'm going to be drawing out a lot of quotes and kind of tying those in. So my first point, worldviews are comprehensive and universal. And I have 2 quotes that I really think sum this up pretty well. You said on page 205 that worldviews are governed by your assumptions about the world in which you live. And, that's our presuppositions kind of that we were talking about last month. These assumptions or presuppositions are first principles of interpretation that give meaning to every fact or idea that enters your mind, end quote. And your second quote was, the Christian should evaluate all life in terms of God's word, not just those certain aspects of reality he considers important. So I thought that was really interesting, talking about the comprehensiveness of your worldview. It needs to be all-encompassing, all areas of life. And we were kind of discussing that a little bit earlier in terms of civil government is part of life, so it needs to be part of our worldview. We need to know what the Bible talks about that, or says to that. So, and by the way, feel free to interject, Gary, at any time. If you have something to add or you want to expound on it, feel free. So,
well, the thing, what we have to understand is, one of the things that Greg Bahnsen makes clear is that there's no neutrality.
Yes.
That everybody has a worldview.
Yep.
Everybody has an eschatology. Everybody has a view of law. Everybody has a view of economics, and it's based upon where do those principles come from? Ultimately, where do those principles to evaluate all these things come from? What is their origin? And then the second part of all that is, how does one account for those fundamental principles that they're using in the development of their worldview? And then thirdly, how then you start giving these people power, they're going to implement that worldview on you.
Yes.
So for the Christian to claim neutrality, that we can't get involved because we're supposed to be neutral in all this, it's just impossible.
Yep.
You can't. The biggest leftist, unbelieving, atheistic person out there, evolutionist, is not neutral.
Yes.
They are going to build their worldview based upon those operating assumptions. There's a fellow right now, and I know his middle name, Noah Harari, he's a professor at in Jerusalem, and this guy is a rabid materialist who works with this Klaus Schwab, who's part of this whole reset deal.
Yep.
And you read his stuff. It's the mirror image of a Christian worldview. It's there's a fundamental set of principles that we must abide by.
Yep.
And it gives the basis for morality, and it goes on and on and on. He talks about this is the way that we should read the Declaration of Independence. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, et cetera, et cetera. These guys are not neutral. They have a worldview like the rest of us.
Yes. Yes.
Well, I should say, because a lot of Christians don't have a Christian worldview. They have a synthetic worldview.
Yep.
They have a general idea that, yes, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. When I die, I'm going to go to heaven. But if you were to sit down with a Christian and talk to them about starting from Genesis and going to the Book of Revelation, outline for me what constitutes a biblical worldview, and include in that family, business, economics, government. You go down the list of things. What does the Bible say about the jurisdictional separation between church and state, which is a real thing?
Yeah.
Where would you go to determine what the Bible says about inflation? Does the Bible address the topic of inflation at all? What about private property? All of these things. And generally, Christians might say, well, the Bible does say you shall not steal. And then say, well, what if I get 51% of the people to vote to say it's okay to take money from some people and give it to other people? What about that? Does thou shalt not steal mean thou shalt not steal except if you get 51% of the vote that says that you can put people in power to steal from some people and give it to other people? So most Christians don't have a comprehensive worldview. They wouldn't know how to put it all together even if they did. And a lot of the things that they would try to implement are things that are borrowed from the unbelieving worldview, because much of it is based upon emotion. Oh, how would we take care of poor people? How would we take care of the sick? As if there are only two ways to do this,
right?
Or actually only one way, to do this.
Yep. The civil government doesn't do it. How could we possibly account for that? Yeah.
yeah. And it comes down to, how does one account for the worldview that they have? And of course, unbelievers cannot remain consistent with the operating assumptions of their worldview. This is extremely important.
Yes.
They have to borrow from the Christian worldview
yes.
in order to maintain their worldview, because while they maintain that as Richard Dawkins says, DNA neither knows nor cares. We just dance to its music. Well, if someone's DNA says that it's okay to kill Richard Dawkins and steal his stuff, Richard Dawkins is going to say, no. There are certain moral values that we've all kind of agreed on over the years.
Backpedal on that.
Yeah. See, that's where we are today. And this was Greg Bonson's, contribution to all of this.
Yes,
is that you point out their operating assumptions, which you get from their own material, force them to live consistently with them, and then don't allow them to borrow from the Christian worldview in order to prop up their very deficient worldview. And so not just in the area of apologetics, but also in the area of government. It's the same thing.
Yep.
Where do you get the basic fundamental principles in order to do this, to come up with this particular policy? Look, these Republicans and so a lot of good Republicans, they can't argue biblically and all this. Of course, they'd be laughed out of Congress if they did. But they're not arguing that way. They're arguing on the premise that there's a kind of common ground between Christians and non-Christians on this topic. I don't know if you've been following this event that took place at Yale Law School last month in March of 2022, where an atheist from a humanist society and a Christian from Alliance Defending Freedom were involved in a discussion about how these two very different worldviews can agree on fundamental rights about freedom of speech. Well, there were like 120 law students who just shouted them both down. How in the world,
Wow.
They said, could you have somebody from the Alliance Defending Freedom up here and to discuss this with? And by the way, the people in the audience were much more consistent than the humanist was, because they began to see why would you allow this Christian over here, even though this Christian agreed with you on this particular fundamental premise? Why would you allow this person in here to give that person any sort of notoriety about it all? And
Yes.
the Christian, look, I know how this works, and ADF is a great organization. I don't want to say anything wrong about it, but I would have liked her to say to the atheist, "You're an atheist. You don't believe in God. You're a materialist. How do you account for any type of liberty? Any type of liberty? How can you defend any type of liberty? And then how can you then come up and oppose somebody who wants to take away someone's liberty within the context of your worldview? How can you do that?"
Yes.
And that I would have loved to have seen it, and I would have asked the same people in these shouters and so forth who literally wanted to fight, punch one of these people out. I would say, hey, you're right. Within the materialistic worldview, it would be okay to come up here and punch this person out.
Yeah.
But see, it would also be, given your operating assumptions, for me to punch you out as well.
Right.
And so, on what basis now do we even consider that anything makes any sense to anyone?
Yep. Really, really good point. Yeah, and thank you for illustrating that too and tying it in. We talked a lot about hypothetical, philosophical, and epistemological ideas with Bonson's book, and it was near the end of the month we were trying to tie it to illustrations so that people could help, try and break some of these concepts down. So I think you did a really good job breaking that down and tying that into a lot of different areas. So neat. Well, my next point, at least one of the big topics that I drew from these two chapters, was that there are really only two primary worldviews. And I have three quotes that I found here. One was from page 200, and I thought this was really interesting. You said Satan intended to overturn God's moral order by convincing Adam and Eve that God's view of his world was only one view among many, right? And that's something that the pluralistic, we hear about that a lot. It's just one worldview amongst a whole bunch of other just equally as valid worldviews. And that was the original lie. That was Satan's original lie, was, it's just one potential option you could go for if you wanted to, And page 201, you said if man's dependence on God for knowledge is considered optional, then God's view of the world is also considered optional. But if our fundamental standard, our primary foundation is not the Word of God, if that's just optional, then God's view of the world is also optional. Everything's up in the air at that point. So I thought that was really interesting.
And then to extend that is everybody's worldview. You take God out of the picture. Everybody's worldview is optional, and it becomes who's ever in power at that time.
Yes, exactly.
Makes the determination of what's right or wrong without any necessary limits on them. And you can see these various cultures that become very authoritarian. They're dictating just exactly the way you ought to believe. And if you don't believe that way, look at China, what's happening today. Yep. The idea of social credit. You don't have this particular social credit, you're not going to have the necessary freedoms. And here in the United States, of course, it's the same. It's very similar.
Yeah, we're working towards that.
Yeah, you can get booted off, some site because, well, you said that this person here who identifies as a woman is in fact a man, and you can't say that, so therefore you've lost your spot on our platform. So there's 1984. Yeah. George Orwell's 1984. By say how many fingers am I holding up here, and you look at the fingers and they say, well, you're holding up. I forget how many it was in the book. But the guy forcing you to say something different from how many fingers are up there, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to maintain that, everybody knows you're not a biologist. I mean, you can't define what a woman is.
Right.
I don't know what Marsha Blackburn, I wish she would have asked, well, are you a woman?
Yeah, right.
Are you a woman?
Yep.
And if she said, well, yes, I am, I said, well, how do you know? On what basis are you a woman? See, this is what needs to be done, and that many Christians aren't equipped to do it. And that is, and we published a book called Pushing the Antithesis, forcing the unbelieving worldview, those who hold this unbelieving worldview, to live consistently with the operating assumptions of that worldview.
Yes.
And Christians aren't taught to do that. Too many Christians in the realm of apologetics is to believe that there's common ground, and you argue with people on the basis of what things you hold in common.
Yes.
And then offer the best basis of your worldview based upon that commonality issue.
Starting from their position.
And Bonson just tore into that and just said, absolutely not. Now, he never said that people weren't acting moral, and that they couldn't do math and they're not logical. It's just that they couldn't account for those things given their operating assumptions.
Yep.
Well, the same thing happens in government. Here, Biden is, he's going to say, oh, well, I'm going to help solve this oil problem by releasing 1 million barrels a day on oil reserves that are actually saved for emergency. So, well, wait a minute. When you do that, that means all the companies out there have wells. Now that I have to compete with oil flooding the market, thus lowering the price and the difficulty it takes, the price it is in order to get this oil out of the ground.
Yeah.
You see, you push these people to live consistently with that. Don't you know what you're doing when you do that? Or there's this one company, if you buy their shoes, they give another pair of shoes to some poor country, somebody in a poor country. Oh, isn't that great? That's nice and sweet. Problem is, a shoe manufacturer in that company now has to compete with free shoes. So all of these things have consequences, and we as Christians need to start being able to think through these issues so that we're not snookered by high sounding.
Yes.
We're here to help you. We're from the government. We're here to help you.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think along those same lines, you segue brilliantly into this next point. What a biblical worldview actually looks like. Like what does this look like? We should be using this as our foundation, but what is that lens? And I have a quote. It's a little bit of a longer quote, but I think it's really, really good. And you wrote this on page 207. It says, for many, the Bible merely imparts spiritual truth with little to say about secular matters, things pertaining to this age. And, a couple months ago, Joe, we were talking about the sacred and the secular. People like to separate those, but it all belongs to Christ. That Cornelius Van Til quote that we use. If you don't push the crown rights of our King Jesus into every realm, we won't have them in any realm. But continuing with the quote, it's important to understand that the Bible does not divide life between sacred and secular. Jesus said, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," which is Matthew 6, verse 10. And all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth, Matthew 28, verse 18. And again, that was from page 207. So, it needs to be, and this falls back into our comprehensive, right? We can't just separate and say, well, that's a secular matter. Well, that's something that really we don't speak to as Christians. It's all comprehensively part of our Christian worldview. So, and if we don't understand something,
if we're not speaking to it, someone else is assuredly speaking to it.
Yes.
When someone says, well, you can't impose your morality on other people, I said, well, when you say that, I guarantee you that the other people are imposing their morality on them.
Exactly.
And that those other people, that means you.
Yes.
And so you've got to lay out. You got to know what. Again, we started off with this. What's the first step? You've got to understand what the issues are, and you have to be able to be educated in order to articulate those positions.
Yes.
I sit around with some of my grandchildren and I'm constantly asking them, questions about things. Ask them a lot of them, geography and whatever, but help them think through an issue. You've got this particular thing. What do you say to somebody who says that? And da 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 da. Now they're very, very young, but the fact that I'm grilling them on this stuff, and I've turned it into a game. Every time if we ever watch a movie together, when the movie's over, I start asking them questions about the movie. We did this with It's a Wonderful Life. Over the Christmas holidays one year, they watched it, and I was asking them a question. I said, "What two Sesame Street characters are in It's a Wonderful Life?" And of course, they didn't know. They didn't really think about it very much. But the policeman and the cab driver, one's named Bert and the other one's named Ernie. And it's not that the Bert and Ernie characters in Sesame Street were named after them, but it's the whole point of observing, paying attention to what you're seeing and hearing, and to be able to formulate a perspective on what's going on, and you project, based upon this, you look at a person's life and the impact that person's life has on other people's lives and so forth. Well, it's the same with ideas. One idea, there was a book written not too many years ago called "Ideas Have Consequences."
Yep.
And so you got to get Christians to start thinking about how, in what way do these ideas have consequences.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Really good points. Do you have something to add, Joe?
No, I just found that interesting. I didn't even catch that. I never watched Sesame Street really ever. But that's kind of cool to think of it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. That is pretty funny. Just my last point here. Victory in Christ. And we were talking a little earlier about, eschatology and how you have to understand a few things before you get to the victory portion of the eschatology, which really, from my perspective, the past 3 or 4 years I've really just started getting into a lot of this and studying it and actually wanting to understand what's happening, or what the Bible's talking about in all of these different areas. But from my perspective, that victory is what really drives. It's how you can kind of tell what a person's eschatological viewpoint is in terms of how they, what are they doing? Are they driven? What are they doing? And maybe they're inconsistent with what they believe, but that motivation. So this victory in Christ, 2 Corinthians 2:14, thanks be to God who in Christ always leads us in triumph. Then Ephesians 6:12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the worldly forces of darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. This is a battle that's happening. And that was our verse a couple weeks back. But you wrote an article, I guess it was March 3rd or 13th, working for earthly objects distant in time. It was a really, really good article. I read through that. I'll have it linked in the description for anybody who wants to read through it. It's a fairly short read, but there's a lot of content in there. And one of your quotes, you were talking about Darby and what he brought up, with premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism. But one of the quotes there was John Nelson Darby, one of the founders of dispensational premillennialism, taught that the imminent return of Christ today, or imminent return of Christ, totally forbids all working for earthly objects distant in time. So I was wondering if you could just comment on that a little bit, and that forbidding of working for things that have a long longevity of permanence, essentially.
Well, the fellow who wrote that, this is in the 19th century, and the fellow who wrote it was a very supportive follower of Darby. And then as he began to think through these things a little bit, he began to wonder, this just doesn't make sense. And so Darby essentially said, look, the only reason you should be involved with, say, mathematics or science and all that, if it had an immediate impact on some evangelistic type issue. Otherwise, don't waste your time on this. And of course, Darby was under the impression that Jesus could return at any time. And so so why? In fact, that was when I wrote the first volume of God and Government. I would oftentimes go out and do some lectures on it. And invariably there'd be somebody say, why are we bothering with this government thing? Jesus is coming back soon.
Wow.
So this was in the 1980s.
Wow.
And Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, came out in 1970. And in that book, he said that Israel becoming a nation again in 1948 was prophetically important, significant. And then he said, Matthew 24:34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And the generation was 40 years. And so you add 40 to 1948, you get 1988. And so when I wrote the God and Government series, 82, 84, and 86, people in the 1980s were expecting the end to take place.
Wow.
And there were, a lot of people over the years have written to me and said, I believed all that. I didn't go to college. I didn't do this because I thought, we were living in the last days.
That's crazy.
And so that had a big effect on people. And I coach track and field, the shot and the discus at a local Christian school. And I've worked with kids for a very, very long time. And you can tell different people and their expectations. You can ask about why they really want to do this and all that, and then you can find the person who's really motivated. So right now I've got a kid who's really motivated. He'll call me up and say, Coach, where are you today? I said, well, your coach said there was no practice today. He said, well, I want to practice, so I drive over there and I work with him.
Oh, wow.
He has a lot of work to do in order to get where he is. But if I immediately said, look, you're only throwing this far, give it up, I'm not, that's it. And that would discourage them.
Right.
And I think it's the same with a lot of people. They look around us, they see what's going on around them, and they say, this is too big of a nut to crack. And as a result of that, I'm not going to do anything. Back to athletics. This kid's in ninth grade. I see what he's throwing in ninth grade, and I can project out if he continues to work. In 4 years, he could do this far, but it's going to take this work up to that time. Well, other people are working too, and most people fall away. Most people give up. There was I was watching this film last night. It was called Tomorrowland. think that's what it was called. George Clooney is in it, and it's all about the future. It's very, if you want to put a label on, very post-millennial in that sense. It's not trying to be post-millennial. It just is very future-oriented. And the young girl who's very interested in technology and so forth, and talking to her father, and the father really he's not real supportive, and he's kind of pessimistic about his job and so forth and so on. And she comes up to him and she's about this story that he tells about every person has two wolves on the inside. One wolf is despair and defeat, and the other wolf is optimistic and looking forward to the future. And the question is, which wolf wins? And of course she said, the one you feed. And so your attitude about something that's out there is extremely important in order to whether or not it's going to change. And I always add to this that yes, there are lots of things that have to change. And I said, look, don't be discouraged by that. Pick one thing that you think God has called you to do and work that one thing. And don't feel guilty that you're not doing everything. Everybody has different gifts and different interests.
Yep.
And the idea of Paul talks about the body, and how it has different parts, and you need all the different pieces. And what generally happens is, just like in sports, not everybody plays the same sport, not everybody plays the same position. They all do different things, and over time things come together, and you have great performances and so forth. And so that it's what you feed. What are you feeding yourself in terms of bringing about fundamental change? And that change has to come within it has to begin with yourself.
Yeah, and that's really good. And I'm going to tie a quote from page 224 into that because I think it works really well. You said a new political order cannot resolve the battle, nor can reconciliation come by military strength and power. And then you quoted, Zechariah 1, verses 18 through 21, and then chapter 4, verse 6. But I think that's really important for us to understand that I listened to a show, the Steve Day Show, and he always says the cavalry ain't coming. You're the cavalry. We can't just sit on the couch and just wait for some movement or some big party to come and fix everything. That's not going to happen. I think the popular phrase from the left is be the change you want to see in the world. We are the ones who God has called to go and make disciples. All authority has been given to him. It's been given to Christ. Now, therefore, because of that, now go and make disciples. This isn't just sit on your couch and do nothing. This is a go. And you had another quote, the gates of hell will not prevail. Those are, defenses. We're on the attack. We're attacking the defenses of the gates of hell.
And the thing you have to understand about all this too is the idea of community. That there are other people out there who think the way we do, and in social media today, and the various networks that are out there, people can be encouraged by what folks Apologia are doing, and the people that Cross Politic are doing, and then Alliance Defending Freedom and other organizations. These things did not exist years ago. They just weren't there. And there are all kinds of websites out there. Even though there's a lot of censorship that's going on, there's still tons and tons of information out there. There are always organizations out there that are doing something. You need to find your niche and involve yourself in it and learn everything you can about that particular area. And don't feel guilty that you're not doing everything, but at the same time, you want to be able to give support to these people who are doing other things, and they do the same for you.
That's a really good point. That is a really good point. So just to I want to end things kind of on a positive note. And there was one discussion topic that I didn't get to, but hopefully in let's say 6 or 7 minutes, we can talk about this, because we do have to wrap it up pretty quickly. But this whole COVID mess is a recent event that has definitely changed aspects of our society, and a lot of that is going to carry into future policy. We're going to see a lot of things that kind of carry over from all the ridiculous stuff that's happened in the past 2 years, the overreaching of government, a civil government in pretty much every country on the planet, except maybe Sweden, and they were already pretty bad to start. Have you seen any examples of a positive movement towards advancing God's kingdom that has come out of the lockdowns, that's come out of all this, where it's kind of woken people up to the fact that, hey, this is bad. Our civil government can do this at the flip of a switch. They had the power. All of this was already lined up and ready to go, and boom, they just implemented all these things. Do you think people have been woken up? Have you seen any positive trends, or do you see most people just kind of going back to normal?
I just think there are different types of people out there who, some are scared to death, some are frantic that this, about wear double masks. They're upset that if someone isn't wearing a mask.
Yeah.
There are government officials who see this as a way to control people. There are lots of people out there who are doing their own homework on all this and beginning to, like my wife and I, we haven't gotten any shots. We only wear a mask when we actually have to wear a mask. Like if we fly somewhere, I got to wear a mask. I think there are a lot of legal battles taking place trying to get these governments from forcing compliance in the military, in government places, and shutting down restaurants. I think a lot of people are in fact fed up with this, but at the same time, it's when supposed people in authority are saying you could die from this, and your grandmother and your grandfather could die from this.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, wow, they, even if they're only 50% right, I want to kind of go along with this. I'm hoping that from all this, we began to see that they've really done a lot of lying about it.
Yes.
And I think it's going to be harder next time for them to do anything. I just see Fauci's talking about another shot and all that. I don't think Biden and Kamala Harris, they got another shot, and Biden said, it didn't hurt a bit. I mean,
Okay.
Wow, I mean, big deal.
Yeah.
I think more and more people today are ignoring it. I think they're going on with their lives. You think about this. Travel is up. Hotels, they're being almost packed now. Winnebago is $4.4 billion in backlogs of vehicles.
Wow.
I think people are going on with their lives, and there's a lot of mistrust that's taking place.
Yeah. Yep. I definitely agree. I'm a little concerned to see some of the pockets that are waking up to this, but aren't. They're maybe not Christian at all, or they are Christian, but they have that synthetic worldview we've been, you talked about in your book, we've been talking about all day. It's concerning to see these people are now they've been woken up, they understand the importance of fighting back, but we've lost that Christian foundation that our founding fathers had that allowed us to, if God is on our side, who can be against us, that allowed them to win the day because God was there because they were following him and doing it his way. It seems like we've lost that as a culture generally, and it's a little concerning to see all of this. Now there's an uprising, but it kind of starting to look a little bit like the French Revolution, It's a bit concerning.
Yeah, I think there's just some things you just, unless you had a revolution, which I don't agree that we should.
Yeah.
In that respect, they never turn out well. French Revolution is a good indicator of that. We had a war for independence, which is not a revolution in the usual sense. When
distinction.
Compared to the French Revolution.
Yep.
It's when governments come in and make these decrees, and then fine you $13,000 for this and for that.
Yep. It was the same here in South Dakota. Yeah.
Yeah. Florida is, look, people get sick all the time. My wife and I are in our 70s, and so we're in the high risk area. But we've suffered no ill effects of anything.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, this has been a really good discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we're really looking forward to seeing you in person this Thursday, but then also reading through the rest of the chapters in Volume 2 of your book, God and Government. So we're going to be reading through chapters 3 and 4 this week, and so next week we'll be talking about that on the show. So for you at home, if you're listening to us or watching us, grab your copy of this book, AmericanVision.org, not .com, .org. Got it right. And follow along with us. It's a really, really cool book. A lot of fascinating information in all 3 volumes. So,
if you get the hardback, there is we have a brand new study guide that goes along with it as well.
Nice. Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. We might have to grab that and see if we can do something with our church with that. That would be really neat. Yeah. Well, very cool. Joe, anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Don't forget, go to trdshow.net. Share that link with as many people as you can. Go to crosspolitic.com/Liberty Tour. And that's where you can register for the Thursday event this Thursday, April 7th, here in Rapid City. See us, see Gary DeMar, all of us in person. We would love to see you there. And as always, we will see you on the next episode.